Your brain was built by an accident of timing, not by a single culture or a single set of childhood conditions, but by the collision between two of them, right in the middle of the years when the brain is most plastic, most quietly laying down the architecture that will govern the rest of your life. If you were born somewhere between the late 1970s and the mid-1980s, you did not simply grow up in a particular era. You grew up across the seam between two entirely different eras. And the brain that formed in that seam is unlike any before it or after it, shaped not by stability, but by the experience of crossing from one world into another while still becoming a person. Psychology has spent decades studying how the environment shapes the developing mind. What it has paid less attention to is what happens when the environment itself fundamentally changes while the mind is still forming. That is your story, and it runs deeper than nostalgia. Before anything else, there was childhood, and what made it psychologically distinct wasn't what it contained, it was what it lacked. There were long afternoons with nothing scheduled, nothing streaming, nothing waiting in your hand to dissolve the silence. Boredom wasn't a failure of stimulation. It was the default state of being. So, you invented things turning sidewalks into racetracks, empty rooms into entire worlds, generating experience from imagination alone. Neuroscientists today would call it the default mode network, the system that activates when external stimulation drops and the mind turns inward, wandering, recombining, creating. For most children now, this network rarely gets the sustained silence it needs. For you, it was the whole afternoon. You also learned to wait, for photographs to develop, for a song to come on the radio, for a friend to arrive at an agreed time, because once they left the house, they were unreachable. Waiting wasn't frustrating, it was normal. And in that waiting, something important formed. The muscle of delayed gratification, the quiet tolerance for uncertainty, the understanding that not everything arrives on demand. Research consistently links delayed gratification with emotional regulation and resilience. You didn't learn this in a classroom. Life taught it through the unhurried architecture of an unconnected childhood. Your social world was physical and unscripted. Conflict happened face to face. You learned to read a room before you ever read a thread. You learned to repair after friction, not escape after discomfort. You are among the last adults whose inner life formed in that analog silence, before attention became a commodity, before boredom was engineered away. And then, precisely as you were becoming yourself, the world changed. Not gradually, not safely across generations, but right in the middle of adolescence, that fragile window when identity is still soft and still asking who I am becoming. 1 year, connection meant a phone tethered to a wall. A few years later, it meant the internet arriving with the shrill sound of a modem glowing in the corner of the room. You were old enough to remember the before, young enough to master the after. That combination created something psychologically rare, a kind of technological bilingualism. You learned the language of analog presence, eye contact, pauses, shared silence. And then you learned the language of digital mediation, usernames, typed, tone, curated selves, connection without proximity. Most people speak one language. You speak both, not as a choice, but as a consequence of when you arrived. For you, the internet was never the air you breathed. It was a place you went, you logged on. And just as importantly, you logged off a clear, almost architectural boundary between your physical life and your digital one. But as adulthood unfolded, that boundary dissolved. The place you used to visit became the environment you lived inside, and somewhere along the way, the log-off door disappeared. You carry, even now, the memory of when it existed. A time when presence and absence were distinct states. When reality itself had an exit button. That memory is not nostalgia. It is cognitive knowledge held by a brain that experienced both sides of a threshold most people can only imagine from one direction. If any part of this feels familiar to you, take a moment to drop a like. It helps more people find conversations like this. And if you enjoy the deeper psychology of how we're shaped, consider subscribing. It really does keep this work going. Identity usually forms from belonging a generation, a culture, a shared story you can point to and say, "That's mine." But for you, that recognition always arrived slightly out of focus. You were told you were Gen X, yet you didn't share their fully analog formation. You were folded into Millennials, yet you never felt native inside the digital world that defined them. So you learned to translate rather than inhabit, to move between generational spaces without fully settling into either. Psychologists describe the result as a hybrid identity, not fragmented, not lost, but genuinely unclassified. You understand the skepticism of older cohorts and the fluid networked self of younger ones. But recognition is not the same as belonging. Over time, this produces a quiet self-perception, immediately recognizable when you hear it. I adapt everywhere, but I originate nowhere. There is real strength in this cognitive flexibility, empathy across difference, comfort with contradiction. But there is also a cost, a softer anchor of identity, fewer cultural mirrors. You constructed continuity internally, from memories that span incompatible eras. Your mind learned to hold discontinuity without collapse. Then came the historical timing. And it arrived, with uncanny precision, exactly when it could do the most psychological damage. You were raised in the long, bright afterglow of a decade that felt almost impossibly stable. The cultural story was simple. Study hard, step into a future, wider and safer than the past. You believed it, because children are supposed to believe the world they inherit will hold. But as you reached the threshold of adulthood, the timing shifted. The dot-com bubble, the very future you were told to prepare for, burst as many of you entered the workforce. Then came September 11th, striking not at midlife but at the moment of launch. First jobs, first apartments, first independent plans. The psychological message was immediate. The world can change overnight, and safety is not guaranteed by progress. And just as recovery seemed possible, the 2008 financial crisis landed precisely as many were approaching traditional milestones: homes, families, consolidating careers. These stacked disruptions imprinted a distinctive worldview that psychologists describe as cynical optimism. You still hold the hope you were raised with, the sense that effort should matter, that the future can improve. But beneath it runs a steady awareness. Structures fail, systems break, timing betrays. So, you plan carefully. You scan for exits. You expect change to arrive unannounced. The world did not wait until you were secure. It changed exactly on cue, at the precise moment you stepped forward to meet it. At work, this formation becomes visible in a specific way. You understand the analog logic of structure and loyalty. You also understand the digital logic of speed, flexibility, and fluid identity. So, you translate explaining to older leaders why attention cannot be commanded indefinitely, explaining to younger colleagues why trust accrues over time. Psychologists call this cognitive flexibility, less a learned competency here than an environmental adaptation. You were trained by transition itself. You become the mediator, the connective tissue. Meetings settle when you reframe, but bridges are rarely noticed unless they fail. Their work is to carry movement quietly. You operate in that same space, not because you were assigned the role, but because your experience naturally spans, divides, that others inhabit separately. You are not merely between generations at work. You are the architecture that lets them function together. By midlife, the weight accumulates in a pattern psychologists call role strain, multiple high-demand roles drawing from the same finite reservoir. Above you, parents are aging. Below you, children are forming in a world more complex than the one you knew, and you are navigating it with analog instincts, improvising boundaries they need but that you never had to be given. Career stability arrived later than expected. Adulthood feeling compressed, as responsibilities intensified just as footing finally solidified. Support flows through you more often than toward you. Not collapse, just continuous load. The weight of holding two generations while still, in some essential way, becoming yourself. But there is something you carry that is becoming genuinely rare, not nostalgia, but lived memory of a human pace that existed before constant connection. You remember what it felt like to be unreachable, and for that to be ordinary. As the world moves further into perpetual presence, that memory becomes more than personal history. It becomes cultural memory, evidence that attention once had margins, that boredom once opened into imagination, that identity could form without audience or archive. After you, childhood starts already connected, already searchable, already seen. The brain that forms in that environment will be capable of things yours isn't, and it will lack things yours has. What yours has is knowledge held in lived experience. What human life feels like when it has room to be slow, uncertain, unobserved. You are not between generations by accident. You are what a transition looks like when it becomes human. The brain that formed there trained in patience, fluent in 2 languages, tempered by stacked disruptions, built to hold contradiction without collapse, is precisely what a world that never stops changing needs. Not in spite of the seam. Because of it,